Good evening, everyone, and welcome back from break. My name is Tina Campton. I am the director of the Barnard Center for Research on Women. It is my great pleasure in that role to be able to welcome you all to this year's Roslyn Silver Class of 27 Science Lecture. As one of only two endowed lectures hosted by BCRW, we consider the Silver Science Lecture an especially important opportunity to introduce our diverse community of feminist scholars and activists to some of the liveliest conversations around challenges and innovations currently being discussed and debated both in the sciences and in adjacency to the sciences. For those of you who have never been to this lecture, each year our field rotates among different disciplines and departments in the natural and social sciences here at Barnard. But occasionally, we decide to highlight the work of an individual whose research crosses disciplinary boundaries and explicitly foregrounds questions of gender, sexuality, and feminism in relation to the sciences and feminist theory more broadly. This was the case several years ago when we hosted our own Beck Jordan Young in this lecture, and it is also the case this year when we are honored to host one of the preeminent contemporary theorists in the fields of science studies and feminist technoscience studies, Professor Karen Barad. Karen Barad is professor of feminist studies, philosophy, and history of consciousness at the University of California, Santa Cruz, where they co-direct the Science and Justice Graduate Training Program funded by the National Science Foundation. This groundbreaking program articulates its unique mission as training, quote, science and engineering students alongside social science and humanities students to identify and respond to moments where research requires attentiveness to questions of policy, ethics, and justice. After receiving a PhD in theoretical particle physics from SUNY Stony Brook, Karen began her academic career in the physics department here at Barnard, before moving into more interdisciplinary spaces at other leading colleges and universities. In many ways, Karen's start here on the Barnard campus makes it even more special to host their return to Barnard and to celebrate the multidisciplinary trajectory of work they have forged since their departure way back in 1989 or 90, something like that. Karen is the author of the critically acclaimed book, Meeting the Universe Halfway, Quantum Physics and the Entanglement of Matter and Meaning, in addition to publishing numerous articles in the fields of physics, philosophy, science studies, post-structuralist theory, and feminist theory. In Meeting the Universe Halfway, Karen developed a critical interpretation of agential realism as a way of understanding the politics, ethics, and agencies involved in practices of observation and knowledge production. Agential realism is for Barad an epistemological, ontological, ethical framework that helps us understand the role of human and the non-human, material and discursive, natural and cultural factors in scientific and other social material practices. Here, the concept of entanglement is crucial. For as they write, quote, to be entangled is not simply to be intertwined with another, as in the joining of separate entities, but to lack an independent, self-contained existence. The hallmark of Barad's work is its capacity to help us think science through feminism and feminist theory, and at the same time, to underline the relevance of scientific analysis to feminist analysis. It is this significant intervention that makes so many of us indebted to the insights of their interdisciplinary work, and we are thrilled to host them as this year's lecture. We look forward to being captivated once again by the wonderfully naughty entanglements you will certainly be presenting in your talk today. Please join me in welcoming Professor Karen Barad.
Wow, there's a lot of people here. I'm just really tickled to be back at Barnard College after all of this time. I learned that I had a position at Barnard College 34 years ago. I was 27 when I was offered the position, and I remember going to get my office keys and being told that the professor had to come themselves to get the key and that they wouldn't give it to students. I also remember having Jana Levin walk into my office at the age of 15 with green hair, asking for a research problem. She was probably the best research assistant I have ever had, and now I would happily be hers. We exchanged texts, and she's in Hawaii right now. Not a bad place to be. Anyway, I'm really delighted to be here, and that was a long time ago, but it's with me right now in this very moment, and that's one of the themes of my talk. In these troubling times, the urgency to trouble time, to shake it to its core, to produce collective imaginaries that undo pervasive conceptions of temporality that take progress as inevitable and the past as something that has passed and is no longer with us, is something so tangible, so visceral, that there is a sense that it is felt in our individual and collective bodies. This urgency is both new and not new. With fascism on the rise around the globe and the threat of accelerated nuclear arms race at hand, tied to a perverse sense of the usability of nuclear weapons, the false security of global strategic deterrence based on MAD, the military doctrine of mutually assured destruction, left exposed and undone by madness, compulsiveness, and hubris, the 20th century is anything but past. The same can surely be said of previous centuries. And if debates on marking the origins of the Anthropocene suggest anything beyond an exacting reading of the layering of sediments used to justify adding a new segment of time to Earth's geological clock, it is perhaps that the structure of temporality, that is, timelines in their linearity, smuggle into the discussion is inadequate to this moment. For if the climate experts in their official report to the International Geological Congress meeting in Cape Town in August 2016 marked the origin of the new epoch to be defined by radioactive elements dispersed across the planet by nuclear bomb tests beginning in 1950. And strong arguments have been made by scientists and non-scientists that offer reasons for using other dates as the golden spike. The debates have mostly been about laying down the marker at the right time, whether at 1492, 1610, 1945, 1950, or 1963 to 66. And they have not, for the most part, questioned whether these times ought to be thought of as falling in a line, as if they were separated from one another by some temporal distance. But rather than understand these differing proposals as merely a simple disagreement about origins, perhaps we should take this as evidence that faith in the existence of a singular determinate origin and the unilinear nature of time itself, the fact that only one moment exists at a time, is waning. Is there a sense of temporality that could provide a different way of positioning these markers of history and understand 1492 as living inside 1945, and even vice versa? Over the years, I've been working my way back to where I started, returning to the questions that have always been with me and continue to drive my work. The ones that drove me to become a student of the humanities in order to learn how to think about justice, while I followed my intellectual passions into the world of physics. Coming back to the questions I wrestled with as I began my graduate studies in physics, done down the block at NYU initially, and became involved in anti-nuclear and other activist work. How can I be responsible to that which I love? in the face of its violent historical legacy and its continuing involvement in the military-industrial complex? Is there a way to do physics responsibly in the aftermath of the atomic bomb? Is the field itself so utterly tainted by and saturated with violence that there is no possibility of subversive participation? If, as feminist science studies scholars have convincingly argued, ethical issues are not limited to the applications of scientific theories, but values are made together with facts inside the operations of what gets called pure science, then are the very practices of theorizing and experimenting caught up in war-making, capitalist projects of expansion and extraction, growth and development, such that they inevitably lead to the production of new forms of violence? How are its theories of space, time, and matter marked by gender, race, sexuality, nationalism, and colonialism? Can we find the traces of this violence even in its most abstract instantiations? And if this is so, are there nonetheless openings that exist within physics that might trouble its hegemony, its authority, its unapologetic epistemological imperialism that claims to cover all of space, time, and matter? Is there a way to use physics' own insights to undermine its entanglement with colonizing practices? Indeed, is it possible that inside such practices we might find radical political imaginaries that are resources for survival rather than destruction, for justice rather than violence? Agential realism has been my attempt to begin to approach some of these questions. I've been committed to the political deconstructive project of opening up this seeming totality called physics in order to nurture the cracks and bring forward its radical possibilities. Interestingly, this deconstructive dynamics, the inevitable generation of its own undoings from within, is an insight that can be found within physics and not only within Derridian deconstruction, which is itself a Derridian or indeed quantum insight. I want to be clear. The point is not to glorify physics, to leave it off the hook as being outside of politics, but on the contrary, to hold it accountable, while at the same time being attuned to the radical political possibilities of its deconstructive opening, to the fact that it might indeed offer new material imaginaries, other possibilities, other worlds that are not merely to come, but exist in the thickness of the now. I also want to emphasize that it's important to keep in mind that the physics that I offer up for your consideration is not offered as the truth, capital T, from the scientists, capital S, as if from on high, but rather agential realism combines insights from my own unique way of understanding quantum physics as diffractively read through insights from a host of different theories that concern themselves with questions of social justice and social and ecological justice, including feminist, queer, trans, critical race theory, disability studies, post-colonial and decolonial studies, Marxist theories, post-structuralism, and deconstruction. That is, the goal is nothing less than finding ways to engage in the practice of doing physics differently, in ways that lend itself to addressing injustices rather than merely reinstating, reinforcing, and proliferating them. A pine tree is time, and bamboo is time. Mountains are time. Oceans are time. If time is annihilated, mountains and oceans are annihilated. Time itself is being, and all being is time. In essence, everything in the entire universe is intimately linked with each other as moments in time, continuous and separate. Time isn't what it used to be. Perhaps it never was. It surely hasn't been itself since the doomsday clock, an instrumental measure of time's own demise, was set at just minutes to midnight. By the way, we're now at 2 minutes to midnight. Time has been shattered, imploded into bits, dispersed by the wind. Moments caught up in turbulent flows, forming eddies, circling back around, returning, reconfiguring what will have been. Time is diffracted, entanglements of past, present, and future, superpositions of now, then, to come, caught up in and performing iterative undoings of the self in its sedimenting historicities. In these troubling times, how can we not trouble time? This talk is drawn from a larger work, which is about troubling times, about the nature of being in time, or rather time being. It concerns itself with thickly entangled tales about the atom bomb, physics, war, militarism, imperialism, racism, and colonialism. Raising questions of history, memory, and politics, this is a story of the inseparability of physics' deconstructive as well as destructive potentials. This account does not offer an alternative history so much as an alternative sense of history. It touches upon the coexistence of multiple material historicities condensed into a moment, an infinitesimal point of space-time mattering. When the splitting of a point, indeed its tiny nucleus, destroys cities and remakes the global geopolitical field, the tracing of entanglements might be a better analytical choice than any nested notion of scale. How large is an infinitesimal? What is the measure of nothingness? What would it take to be able to hear the silent cries, the murmuring silence of the void in its materiality and potentiality? What are the conditions of impossibilities, of living, dying in voids produced by techno-scientific projects and other forms of colonial conquest? And I just want to say a little something about the way I just pronounced impossibilities, because in writing this, I have a slash, im/possibilities. And when I use the slash, excuse me, I try to be consistent with the fact that what I mean there is not simply an and, not simply impossibilities and possibilities, but in honoring the notion of intra-action in agential realism, that it's a cutting together apart. It's more than an and, okay? So, and it's more than a both. The next section of the paper is called Time Being. Matter fell from grace during the 20th century. It became mortal. Very soon after that, it was murdered, exploded at its core, torn to shreds, blown to smithereens. The smallest of smallest bits, the heart of an atom, was broken apart with a violence that made the earth and the gods quake. In an instant, in a flash of light brighter than 1,000 suns, the distance between heaven and earth was obliterated. I am become death, the destroyer of worlds. There was a time when matter stood outside of time, but in the intervening years between the two world wars, physicists broke with the more than 1,000-year-old tradition inherited from the Greeks and placed matter in the hands of time. Quantum field theory, a mixture of quantum theory, special relativity, and classical field theory, was responsible for this radical change in the order of things. Physicists began working on quantum field theory starting in the late 1920s, but quickly ran into difficulties. Most seriously, the so-called infinities problem, which was not resolved before the war. The war effort interrupted the development of the theory, at least in the West, because the same physicists who were hard at work on quantum field theory were called on to work on and take the lead on the development of new military technologies. This is not a coincidence. Nuclear physics developed alongside and inside quantum field theory, and many of the top physicists around the world were working on quantum field theory and nuclear physics. Skills, techniques, approaches to cracking hard problems, and more were traded back and forth between military research and the most abstract efforts in physics. In many ways, the war effort for physicists around the globe was discontinuous with work in pure theoretical physics. Whether time was marked as continuous or discontinuous, it is important, and importantly not coincidental, that the physicists working at the forefront of the development of quantum field theory were integrally involved in the production of wartime technologies, including the atom bomb. It is perhaps no surprise, then, that at the very core of quantum field theory are questions of time and being. This section of the paper is space-time diffractions and the superposition of all possible histories. The paper is divided up into 3 sections. Diffraction is a matter of patterning attuned to differences. Waves make diffraction patterns precisely because multiple waves can be in the same place at the same time, and a given wave can be in multiple places at the same time. Particles do neither. By definition, particles are localized entities that take up space. They can be here or there, but not in 2 places at once. However, it turns out that entities we take to be particles can produce diffraction patterns under specific circumstances. How can this be? According to quantum physics, this is because a given particle can be in a state of superposition. To be in a state of superposition between 2 positions, for example, is not to be here or there, or even here and there. Rather, it is to be indeterminately here-there. That is, it is not simply that the position is unknown, but rather there is no fact of the matter as to whether it is here or there or anywhere. That is, it is a matter of ontology, not merely epistemology. As a result of this indeterminacy of position, things we have taken to be particles can in fact exhibit diffraction patterns under particular circumstances, or rather, when they do exhibit a diffraction pattern, it is an expression of the fact that they are in a state of superposition. Note that while it is tempting to say that a given particle in a state of superposition is in 2 places at once, this is a simplification that doesn't fully capture the complexities. For one thing, a particle by definition has a determinate position. And furthermore, if one were to perform a measurement to directly test the hypothesis that a particle is in 2 places at once, by testing, for example, which slit it went through, then it wouldn't be. That is, it wouldn't be a particle because a particle only shows up in 1 place at a time. And even though the pattern produced when the position isn't being measured can only be accounted for as if it were in 2 places at once, that is, that it behaves as a wave, in which case it isn't a particle. Patterns of differencing, or we might say differencing, are arguably at the core of what matter is, and are at the heart of how quantum physics understands the world. Indeed, Nobel laureate physicist Richard Feynman proposed an understanding of quantum physics based solely on the notion of diffraction, that is, superposition. To see this, it is first of all important to note that according to quantum physics, there is no determinate path that a particle takes in going from one position to another. That is, no such path exists. But what physicists can do is calculate the probability that a given particle that starts out here will wind up there. The quantum probabilities are calculated by taking account of all possible paths connecting the 2 points. In other words, a given particle that starts out here and winds up there is understood to be in a superposition of all possible paths between the 2 points, or in its 4-dimensional quantum field theory elaboration, all possible space-time histories. But these possibilities are not to be thought of in the usual way. It is not that each history is merely possible and ultimately only one will manifest. The very meaning of a superposition is that all possible histories are happening together. They all coexist and mutually contribute to the overall pattern, else there wouldn't be a diffraction pattern. Quantum physics opens up another possibility beyond the relatively familiar phenomenon of spatial diffraction, namely temporal diffraction. And during the Q&A, I'd be happy to give some evidence for this, but I'm going to skip that part right now and talk about temporal diffraction. The existence of temporal diffraction is due to a less well-known indeterminacy principle, the time-energy indeterminacy principle. This indeterminacy principle plays a key role in quantum field theory. As a result of this indeterminacy principle, a given particle, what we take to be a particle, can be in a state of superposition of different times. For example, this one particle right here between my fingers can be in a state of coexisting at multiple times, for example, yesterday, today, and tomorrow. Temporality is not merely multiple, but rather temporalities are specifically entangled and threaded through with one another, such that there is no determinate answer to the question, what time is it? This takes a bit of getting used to, even more so than spatial diffraction, but temporal diffraction has in fact been observed experimentally. And in an important sense, although it's not usually talked about, it lies at the core of quantum field theory. Indeed, it is possible to do a diffraction experiment in both space and time, whereupon a single particle will coexist in multiple places and times. In the case of space-time diffraction, a diffraction pattern can be accounted for by taking account of all possible space-time histories, understanding that each such possibility coexists with all others. This paper is itself a diffraction experiment in which I diffractively read different fragments of the atomic bomb through each other, most prominently a novella by Kyoki Hayashi, and the story of quantum field theory being performatively crafted here as we go. Quantum field theory resides inside Hayashi's story, and Hayashi's story is in the interior of quantum field theory, its inner workings, a strange topology. Diffraction as methodology is a matter of reading insights through rather than against each other, in an effort to make evident the always already entanglement of specific ideas in their materiality. The point will not be to make analogies, but rather to explore patterns of differentiating entangling that not only sprout from specific material conditions, but are enfolded in the patterning in ways that trouble binaries such as macro, micro, nature, culture, center, periphery, general, specific, that tempt and support analogical analysis. This next section of the paper is called From Trinity to Trinity. Time and being are at the heart of From Trinity to Trinity, a remarkable novella by award-winning author Kyoko Hayashi. Hayashi has spent the past 3 decades chronicling the experiences of hibakusha, explosion-affected people, atomic bomb victims. Having at age 14 lived through an event that refuses to end, that decays with time but will forever continue to happen, she has spent time laboring through times, travel hopping is what she calls it, in order to unpack some of the infinite density of one particular space-time point, Nagasaki, Japan, August 9, 1945, 11:02 a.m. Kyoko Hayashi's novella From Trinity to Trinity traces the space-time wanderings of an older unnamed woman on a spiritual political pilgrimage, a journey of returning to a land she had never visited before, but knew better than the geography of her own body, a land whose wounds and woundedness live inside her bones. Making her way to Trinity site in New Mexico, where the first plutonium atomic bomb test took place, Hayashi's protagonist travel hops from one space-time point to another, circling back, returning, and turning our attention to a multiplicity of entangled, violent colonial histories condensed into August 9. She is at once in Nagasaki, working alongside classmates in the Mitsubishi arms factory, on a U.S. Air Force base in New Mexico, visiting the National Atomic Museum as the lone Japanese visitor among otherwise white tourists who were there to learn about U.S. nuclear defense history. And in 16th century North America, when Spanish explorers invaded the land now called New Mexico. Her goal is not one of personal healing per se, but rather a political and spiritual commitment to take responsibility for remembering the countless people who were robbed of their own deaths by unspeakable violence. Centering the relationship between time and justice, together with Derrida, she might say that what drives her is, quote, this responsibility and this respect for justice concerning those who are not there, those who are no longer or who are not yet present and living. From Trinity to Trinity is a story that embodies questions of history, memory, politics, nationalism, colonialism, race, species, violence, and sensuality. Her point is not to try to make sense out of senselessness, as if a rational story could be made of the madness, or a refreshingly mad story made of the rationalisms, but rather to take hold of the radical possibility of the undoing of August 9. This is a journey across space-time, nation-states, species beings, and questions of being, non-being. But it should not be mistaken for a time travel story, not in the usual sense. The travel hopping tale is very different from time travel novels, where the protagonist is an autonomous unified subject who continues to live in the time of their present, while returning to a past that once was, a past that continues to exist and remain accessible to those with sufficient ingenuity and technological know-how in an attempt to rework some crucial point in a chain of events that will then propagate forward in deterministic fashion in a rewriting of history. Hayashi's travel hopping does not lend itself to such stories. In Hayashi's story, what is at stake is not setting time aright as if that were possible, but rather the undoing of time, of universal time, of the notion that moments exist one at a time, everywhere the same, and replace one another in succession. It is also a story of time being that undoes the unified notion of self and what it means to be human. The travel hopper must risk her sense of self, which never has been one or itself. Travel hopping, tracing the entanglements of space-time mattering, is not the same as writing a linear chronology mistaken for personal or collective history. Travel hopping is the embodied material labor of cutting through, undoing colonialist thinking in an attempt to come to terms with the unfathomable violences of colonialism in their specific material entanglements. How else might she begin to approach the infinite inhumanity of the weapons of instantaneous mass destruction that in a flash obliterates time? This next section of the paper is called Tracing Entanglements and the Material Traces of Erasure. Tracing paths is no easy task. It takes work. During the waning decades of the 20th century, the most murderous century in history, the notion that the past might be open to revision through a quantum eraser came to the fore. The quantum eraser experiment is a variation of a two-slit diffraction experiment, an experiment which Richard Feynman said contained all the mysteries of quantum physics. Against this fantastic claim of the possibility of erasure, I argue that in paying close attention to the material labors entailed, the claim of erasure's possibility fades, while at the same time bringing to the fore a relational ontology sensibility to questions of time, memory, and history. The key features of the quantum eraser experiment are as follows. Recall that the famous two-slit experiment can be used to show that what we take to be particles under the right conditions exhibit wave behavior. Namely, they produce a diffraction pattern. And this pattern is produced only if each entity that we take to be a particle does something like go through both openings at once, as a good wave does, and that's how diffraction patterns are formed. On the other hand, if you modify a two-slit apparatus by adding a device that measures which slit a particle goes through, it does in fact go through one slit or the other like a good particle, contributing to the creation of a scatter pattern and not a diffraction pattern. Now here's where the quantum eraser part comes in. If the experimenter adds a device that enables the erasure of the information about which slit a particle goes through after it has already gone through the diffraction grating, remarkably, a diffraction pattern appears, indicating that each particle will have gone through both slits at once, if you allow me that fast hand. All right? This raises the seeming impossible possibility that one can determine after the fact whether the particle will have gone through one slit or the other, like a particle does, or through both slits at the same time, like a wave, after it has already passed through the diffraction grating and made a mark on the screen. So I like the little giggles that propagated through after I said it the first time. This is quite the thing to take in, but I assure you, and if you want more details of the experiment, I can explain it during the Q&A. This is what happens. The claim made by physicists who proposed and conducted the quantum eraser experiment claim that this is evidence of changing the past. But it is important to slow down and carefully examine the evidence behind this claim, because the very nature of time and being, or rather time being, itself is in question and can't be assumed. For one thing, the experimenters underestimate the nature of the evidence at hand. What this experiment tells us is not simply that a given particle will have done something different in the past, but that the very nature of its being, its ontology in the past, remains open to future reworkings. That is, whether it will have been a wave or a particle, which are defined to be ontologically different kinds. In particular, I have argued that this experiment offers empirical evidence for a relational hauntology and against a metaphysics of presence. So some people think Derrida is rolling over in his grave right now, but I think if he's doing so, he's got a big smile. The physicists who proposed the quantum eraser experiment interpret these results as the possibility of changing the past, and they speak of the diffraction pattern as having been recovered, as if the original pattern has returned, and the witchlet information as having been erased. But this interpretation is based upon assumptions that are being called into question by this very experiment. Assumptions concerning the nature of being and time. Crucially, the diffraction pattern is not immediately evident once the information is erased. That it is not the case that the original diffraction pattern returns. Rather, a new diffraction pattern can be found within the scatter pattern if and only if the experimenter is clever enough to know how to trace the existing entanglement. This point is crucially important. For the labor expended in tracing the entanglements, including figuring out how to find the extant entanglements and then tracing them, is a necessary step in making the experiment work. Remarkably, this experiment makes evident that entanglements survive the measurement process, and furthermore, that material traces of attempts at erasure can be found in tracing the entanglements. Indeed, these experiments show that while it is possible to erase particular marks that seem to suggest that the past has changed, it is a fantasy to believe that this constitutes an erasure of all traces of this history. Erasure is itself a material practice, an iteratively interactive sedimenting that leaves its trace in the very worlding of the world. I have argued that an interpretation that seems to be in better accord with the empirical evidence than the one offered by the experimenters is that while the past is never finished and the future is not what will unfold, the world holds, or rather is, the memories of its iterative reconfigurings. All reconfigurings, including atomic blasts, violent ruptures and tears in the fabric of being, of space-time mattering, are sedimented into the world in its iterative becoming and must be taken into an account in any objective analysis. This section of the paper is called History, Memory, and Traces of Erasure on the Way to Trinity. Soon my eyes caught some big letters on a panel, Countdown to Nagasaki. Hayashi's protagonist is visiting the National Atomic Museum in New Mexico, an unexpected stop on the way to Trinity site. I felt time stop in front of the panel, Countdown to Nagasaki. While the time towards death in Nagasaki was ticking, what were Kana and I doing in the Ohashi arms factory? At that very moment the bomb left the plane, I was trying to locate the sound of a small roar the factory chief told us he had just heard. I closed my eyes and bowed my head to the photograph. The ruin of a fire printed underneath the explanation was the city of Nagasaki with Inisayama across the river. The effect appears to be the same as Hiroshima, boxcar pilot Sweeney said in the first report on the attack on Nagasaki. A majority of the city has suddenly been destroyed. Even though I am watching the actual scene, I still cannot believe it. Here is the photograph of that destroyed city. The photo shows a burned field, but under what is seen on that printed paper is teacher T, who died instantly, and classmates A, O, and others. In this brief passage where chronology has no pace, where multiple temporalities present themselves without any one of them being present, their very coexistence disassembling the alleged determinate distinction between memory and history, Hayashi offers us a pointed contestation of official museum history, a tale told in chronological time, a scientized and sanitized account of objective reality, the God's eye view from above, the view from nowhere. Disrupting this chronology helps us see through the photograph to what is behind it, namely all the various material discursive apparatuses of bodily production that make up this exhibit, what it contains, what it erases, which facts matter, and how they are collected and framed. What the official photo shows is an aerial view of a city destroyed, the leveling of buildings into a structural void. What the museum history invisibilizes is the structure of the void, the entangled material histories of death and dying, all the ravages of untold history, histories of colonialism, racism, and materialism, and all the attempted erasures that constitute it. By contrast, what is at stake for Hayashi is a matter of empirical reality, the reality literally on the ground. we come to see that what the photo shows is not the bare facts of history, but rather a record of erasures. The literal erasure of lives obliterated like so many buildings, people in the streets on foot and on bicycles, workers stacking shelves in neighborhood shops, school children working in factories, old people and children in their homes, but also a particular framing of the event that makes use of distance to sanitize the suffering and devastation of lives while erasing some histories of violence and not others. Japanese imperialist aggression is the given background against which this history is shot, while US imperialism and militarism are outside of the frame, and so is Japanese imperialism against Korea and China. There were very many Koreans who died in the bombings. Erasure upon erasure. But erasures are never complete. Traces always remain. In her disjointed time hopping, Hayashi's narrator is bodily tracing these extant entanglements. The official photograph freezes time and reifies space, but there were other photographs taken during the bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, photographs on the ground, not ones engineered by humans designed to capture the successes of military operations, but rather very close-up and personal photos taken by the bomb itself. Shadows of incinerated bodies, human and non-human, captured on walls made into photographic plates by the intensity of the blast. What lies inside the boundaries of a shadow? Where are its edges? Diffraction unsettles colonialist assumptions of space and time, beginnings and ends, continuity and discontinuity, interior and exterior. Standing in the museum, she notes another integral part of the official museum history and its contemporary framing. There were no Black or Mexican visitors, not only in this museum, but also in Los Alamos and at Trinity site. All the visitors were white. Jumping in time, but continuing the thought, Hayashi introduces another invisibilized piece of the story, one so covered over by colonialism's practices of erasure and erasure of erasure, that the white visitors might, at least at first, question its relevance. What is the story of this very land that the museum stands on, and that on which the bomb was first dropped? It is a story of late 16th century European colonial conquest of Native American peoples and lands, entangled with early 20th century US colonial annexation of New Mexico in the wake of the US invasion of Mexico half a century earlier, entangled with the wartime designation of native land deemed uninhabited as Trinity site, entangled with existing and future cancers of the nobodies who were downwind from the test site. Importantly, attempts at erasure always leave material traces. What is erased is preserved in the entanglements, in the diffraction patterns of being becoming. In tracing the material entanglements extant in practices of erasure, Hayashi's narrator gives us a sense, hold on one second, I've lost a page. It's a good thing that the time is out of joint. Okay. Where was I? Hayashi's narrator gives us a sense of how boundaries of lands and bodies get diffractively materialized and sedimented through one another. The various forms of violence, including all the erasures, are written into the very fabric of the world, into the specific configurings of space-time mattering, so that it is crucial that she make the pilgrimage to trace the entanglements with her marked and wounded body. Hayashi's narrator bodily traces these entanglements of colonialist histories, violent erasures, and avoidances as an integral part of a sacred practice of remembering, which is not a going back to what was, but rather a material reconfiguring of space-time mattering in ways that attempt to do justice to account for the devastation wrought and to produce openings, new possible histories, reconfigurings of space-time mattering through which time beings might find a way to endure. Okay, well, just when you thought I was finished, I'm not. I'm sorry, I always have to explain the physics. If you guys came in here knowing the physics, I could just go ahead and my talk would be half as long. Anyway, if you'll just indulge me for another little while, I think it'll be worth it. So this part is called Quantum Field Theory and Remembering, the Undoing of Self, and a counter-politics to colonialism's avoidances and erasures. Land occupation as a mode of empire building has been and continues to be tied to a logics of the void. Justification for occupying land is often given on the basis of colonialist practices of traveling to quote-unquote new lands and quote-unquote discovering all matters of quote-unquote voids. For example, population voids, lands allegedly unpopulated before the arrival of settlers, voids of ownership, of development, of territorial sovereignty, land devoid of civilization or of inhabitants with labor relations to the land. The doctrine of terra nullius is one such tool of empire building. Whatever the specific nature of the alleged absence, a particular understanding of the notion of the void defines the colonialist practices of avoidances and erasures. The void occupied a central place in Newton's natural philosophy. He wavered about the existence of an ether permeating empty space, but unlike many of his contemporaries who were still committed Aristotelians and equated matter with extension, Newton insisted that the void was a spatial frame of reference within and against which motion takes place. Matter is discrete and finite, and the void is continuous and infinite. The void exists indefinitely in all directions, and bits of matter take their position in the void. All in all, the void is quite literally universal, measuring the full extent of the universe and beyond, and therefore only very sparsely populated. And since property rests with matter as one of its founding characteristics, the absence of matter is an absence of property and also the absence of energy, work, and change. The void in classical physics is that which literally doesn't matter. It is merely that which frames what is absolute. While the so-called voyages of discovery, bringing data culled from European journeys to non-European sites, aided Newton in his efforts to develop a natural philosophy that united heaven and earth, Newtonian physics helped consolidate and give scientific credence to colonialist endeavors to make claims on lands that were said to be devoid of culture and reason. If classical physics insists that the void has no matter and no energy, the quantum principle of ontological indeterminacy, in particular the indeterminacy relation between energy and time, calls into question the existence of such a zero energy, zero matter state, or rather makes it into a question with no decidable answer. Not a settled matter, or rather no matter. And if the energy of the vacuum is not determinately zero, it isn't determinately empty, since energy and matter are equivalent, E equals mc squared, my only equation in the talk. That is, according to quantum field theory, the vacuum can't be determinately nothing because the indeterminacy principle allows for fluctuations of the quantum vacuum. How can we understand vacuum fluctuations? If the physicist's conception of a field can be likened to a drumhead with a zero energy state being akin to a perfectly still drumhead, and a field with finite energy being a drumhead in one of its quantized vibrational modes, like the 3D analog of harmonics of a string, then while the classical vacuum state would be perfectly still without any vibrations, a quantum vacuum state, although it has zero energy, is not determinately still as a result of the energy-time indeterminacy principle. Vacuum fluctuations are the indeterminate vibrations of the vacuum, or the zero energy state. Indeed, the vacuum is far from empty, for it is filled with all possible indeterminate yearnings of space-time mattering. Or in this drum analogy, the vacuum is filled with the indeterminate murmurings of all possible sounds. It is a speaking silence. What stories of creation and annihilation is the void telling? How might we approach the possibility of listening? Putting this point in the contemporary language of particles rather than fields, we can understand vacuum fluctuations in terms of the existence of virtual particles. Virtual particles are quanta of the vacuum fluctuations. So they're not being and they're not being. That is, virtual particles are quantized indeterminacies in action. Virtuality is the indeterminacy of being, non-being, a ghostly non-existence. The void is a spectral realm. Not even nothing can be free of ghosts. Virtual particles do not traffic in a metaphysics of presence. They do not exist in space and time. They are ghostly non-existences that teeter on the edge of the infinitely thin blade between being and non-being. They speak of indeterminacy, or rather, no determinate words are spoken by the vacuum, only a speaking silence that is neither silence nor speech, but the conditions of impossibility for non-existence. There is an infinite number of possibilities, but not everything is possible. The vacuum isn't empty, but neither is there anything in it. Hence, we can see that indeterminacy is key not only to the existence of matter, but also to its non-existence, that is, to the nature of the void. In fact, this indeterminacy is responsible not only for the void not being nothing, while not being something, but it may in fact be the source of all that is, a womb that births existence. Particles, together with their antiparticles in pairs, can be created out of the vacuum by putting the right amount of energy into the vacuum, thereby giving a virtual particle-antiparticle pair enough energy to emerge from the vacuum. Similarly, particles, together with their antiparticles in pairs, can go back into the vacuum, emitting the excess energy. Hence, birth and death are not the sole prerogative of the animate world. So-called inanimate beings also have finite lives. Particles can be born and particles can die, explains one physicist. In fact, it is a matter of birth, life, and death that requires the development of a new subject in physics, that of quantum field theory. Quantum field theory is a response to the ephemeral nature of life, unquote. The void is a lively tension, not an opposition between living and dying, but a dynamism of indeterminacy, a threading through of one with the other, a desiring orientation towards being becoming, which necessarily entails living dying. The vacuum is far from empty. Rather, it is flush with yearning, with innumerable possibilities, imaginings of what was, could be, might yet have been, all coexisting. Don't for a minute think that there are no material effects of yearning and imagining. Virtual particles are experimenting with the impossibilities of non-being, but that doesn't mean they aren't real. On the contrary, consider this headline. It's confirmed. Matter is merely vacuum fluctuations. The article explains that most of the mass of an atom, its nucleus made of protons and neutrons, which constitutes the bulk of an atom, is due not to its constituent particles, the quarks, which only account for about 1% of its mass, but rather to the contributions from virtual particles. And even the quark itself, we could go on and say, is really vacuum fluctuations. So the void can no longer be thought of as that which doesn't matter. Quantum field theory not only reworks the classical understanding of the void, but also of matter and their inseparability. Consider the classical physics view of an electron, one of the simplest particles, a point particle, a particle so small to be of zero dimension. Not only is it without extension, it is without an interior, completely devoid of structure. And yet, it causes a great deal of trouble both for classical and quantum physics. According to quantum field theory, as a result of the time being indeterminacy, the electron does not exist as an isolated particle, but is always already inseparable from the wild activities of the vacuum. That is, the electron is always already interacting with the virtual particles of the vacuum in every imaginable way. Let's take just a very small peek into the electron and the infinite number of wild things going on. Electrons are charged particles, which means that they are susceptible to, or we might even say inclined towards touching and being touched. Indeed, touching, according to physics, is but an electromagnetic interaction between charged particles. The reason the desk feels solid, or the cat's coat feels soft, or we can even hold coffee cups in one another's hands is an effect of the electromagnetic repulsion and attraction. All we ever feel is the electromagnetic force, not the other whose touch we seek. The electromagnetic force experienced between two charged particles depends upon the relative nature of their charges. Opposites attract, and like charges repel one another. Now, since a charged particle emits an electromagnetic field, and a charged particle positioned in the electromagnetic field feels an electromagnetic force on them, the electron being charged both emits and interacts with its own field. This self-touching interaction, a constitutive part of what an electron is, turns out to be the source of unending anxiety in the physics community. Commenting specifically on the electron's self-energy interaction, the physicist Richard Feynman expressed horror at the electron's monstrous nature and its perverse ways of engaging with the world. Quote, "Instead of going directly from one point to another, the electron goes along for a while and suddenly emits a virtual photon, the carrier of the electromagnetic field, and then horrors. It absorbs its own photon. Perhaps there's something immoral about that, but the electron does it," unquote. This self-energy, such self-touching term, has been labeled a perversion of the theory because its value is infinite, which is an unacceptable answer to any question about the nature of the electron, such as what is its mass or its charge. Apparently, touching oneself or being touched by or in touch with oneself, the ambiguity may itself be the key to the trouble, is not simply troubling, but a moral violation, the very source of all the trouble. But it's worse, or better, than that. For this simple self-energy interaction is not a process that happens in isolation either. All kinds of more involved things can and do occur in this interaction with this frothy brew of nothingness. In fact, there is a virtual exploration of every possibility, an infinite set of possible ways of self-touching. So there is an infinity of infinities. In fact, Richard Feynman proposed, what else? A renormalization procedure that attempts to reel in the electron's queerness, its unruliness. According to this procedure, the bare electron, which is mathematically infinite, is dressed with the infinite contributions of the virtual particles of the vacuum, such that in the end, the physical electron is finite. Bare and dressed, these are technical terms. That's the language physicists use in talking about renormalization. So that is, what renormalization entails is the subtraction of two infinities to get something finite. This renormalization procedure entails taking into account all possible interactions with all virtual particles in all possible ways, that is, all possible histories. Hence, according to quantum field theory, even the smallest bits of matter are an enormous multitude. Each individual is made up of all possible histories of virtual interactions with all others. Or rather, according to quantum field theory, there is no such thing as a discrete individual with its own roster of properties. In fact, the other, the constitutively excluded, is always already within. The very notion of the self is a troubling of the interior-exterior distinction. Matter is the indeterminacy of its being undoes identity and unsettles the very foundations of non-being. Together with Derrida, we might then say, identity can only affirm itself as identity to itself by opening itself to the hospitality of a difference from itself or a difference with itself. Conditions of the self, such a difference from and with itself, would then be its very thing, the stranger at home. This makes Derrida so much clearer, doesn't it? What is being called into question here is the very nature of the self. All selves are not themselves, or rather time beings. The self is dispersed, diffracted through time and being. In an undoing of the inside-outside distinction, it is undecidable whether there is an implosion of otherness or a dispersion of self throughout space-time mattering. Hence, matter is an infolding, an involution. It can't help touching itself. And in this self-touching, it comes into contact with the infinite alterity that it is. Ontological indeterminacy and unending dynamism of the opening up of possibilities is at the core of mattering. How strange that indeterminacy and its infinite undoing of closure is the condition for the possibility of all structures in their dynamically reconfiguring stabilities and instabilities. According to quantum field theory, then, the void is not absence. Indeed, nothingness is an infinite plenitude, not a thing, but a dynamic of iterative reopening that cannot be disentangled from what matters. So now I'm coming to the last section of the paper, which is entitled Returning and Remembering. Ironically, the land that was denounced as wilderness, in which no white people's culture could prosper, became cultivated by the invaders' bloody battles and desires. Every Hibaksha knows that survival carries within it the wailing and silence of the dead. The climax of the novella is the narrator's trip to Trinity site, the place where the first plutonium bomb was detonated on July 16, 1945 at 5:29 a.m. It is here at the end of her journey, the very place where it all began, standing in the midst of the desert, inside a fenced area where nothing inside it save a monument to nothingness, to ground zero, that the fullness of these embodied tracings of all the various colonial entanglements comes full circle. Hayashi is committed to being a chronicler of August 9. Given that she deliberately writes against the grain of chronology, perhaps Hayashi's commitment to tracing the material entanglements condensed into the space-time point of August 9 might be more aptly captured by the more unconventional title, Travel Hopping Scribe of August 9. From Trinity to Trinity is not a time travel novel, but a time diffraction tale, an embodied pilgrimage committed to tracing the material entanglements, a risky journey of placing one's body in touch with all matter of specific colonialist histories, an iterative circling back around, touching the infinite alterity that constitutes a point. What is the structure of the infinity of a point labeled on some calendars as August 9? Returning to a point, to face the incalculable. Being an August 9 travel hopping scribe is different from being a historian. For one thing, it involves making the journey in space and time, tracing the multiple histories with one's body, putting the self at risk as part of a committed responsibility to those who have died and those not yet born. It entails recognizing material kinship with this exploded, imploded moment in time. I am going to Trinity, she tells her friend. The truth is, even today, I still want to break away from August 9. I have always wished I was not related to August 9. Katsura, my son, is a second-generation Hibaksha. He disliked being an inmate on death row without a prison term. He wanted to live away from August 9. Trinity is the starting point of my August 9. It is also the final destination of Hibakusha, from Trinity to Trinity. If I make that journey, I can hold August 9 within my life circle. If I can never be free from the event, I should end my relationship by swallowing it. What does it mean to swallow an event? Perhaps this is an evocation of the Ouroboros, the mythical symbol of the serpent biting its tail, representing creation out of destruction, life out of death. Or perhaps it means to ingest the event like radiation, to take it into your gut, to feel it leach into your bones, mutate your innards, and reset your cellular clocks. Perhaps it is about the impossibility of metabolizing the trauma, transforming the self from victim to survivor. Perhaps it is a way of undoing the self, of touching oneself through touching all others, taking in the multitude of others that make up the very matter of one's being in order to materially transform the self and one's material sense of self. Perhaps it is about the willingness to put oneself at risk, to place one's body on this wounded land, to be in touch with it, to have a felt sense of its textures, to come to terms with a shared sense of vulnerability and invisibility, to feel the ways that this land, this void, which marks the colonizers' continuing practices of avoidance, always already inhabits the core, the nucleus of your being. I walked to ground zero. From this point in July 50 years ago, the flash of light of the atomic bomb ran all directions in the desert. I heard on the very day of the experiment it had been raining hard since morning, unusual in New Mexico. The experiment was carried out in heavy rain. The flash of light boiled the downpour, and with that white froth ruined the fields, burned the helpless mountains, and shot up to the sky. And then silence. Without time to defend and fight back, the wilderness was forced into silence. Let us pause before this silence, before rushing on, this silence threaded through with all matter of murmuring, so many cries that might have been but never were. From the bottom of the ground, from the exposed red faces of faraway mountains, from the brown wasteland, the waves of silence came lapping and made me shudder. How hot it must have been. Until now, as I stand at the Trinity site, I have thought it was we humans who were the first atomic bomb victims on Earth. I was wrong. Here are my senior Hibakusha. They are here but cannot cry or yell. Tears filled my eyes. Here at ground zero, time being was shaken to its core. Matter was split off from itself, traumatized. Violence tears holes in the very fabric of the world in its sedimenting, iterative interactivity. Woundedness is not reserved for human beings. Landscapes are not stages, containers, or mere environments for human and non-human actors. Landscape is not merely visually akin to a body. It is the skin of the earth. Ask Georgia O'Keeffe. Land is not property or territory. It is a time being, a material geobiography of bones and bodies, ashes and earth, where death and life meet. Etymological entanglements already hint at a troubling of assumed boundaries between allegedly different kinds. Earth, humus, from the Latin, is part of the etymology of human. And similarly, Adam, Hebrew for man or humankind, derives from Adamah, Hebrew for ground, land, earth, giving lie to assertions of the firm distinction between human and non-human, suggesting a relationship of kin rather than kind, a cutting together apart. Time beings do time beings do not merely inhabit, but rather are of the land timescape, the space-time mattering of the world in its sedimented enfoldings of iterative interactivity. Memory is not merely a subjective capacity of the human mind. Rather, human and mind are part of the land timescape of the world. Memory is written into the worlding of the world in its specificity, the ineliminable trace of the sedimenting historicity of its iterative reconfiguring. No wonder Hayashi understands land, in this case, this marked void, this silenced land, as the ground for respectful, just, and nonviolent mourning, for remembering. Remembering is a bodily activity tied to the materiality of the land as time being. She must place her body on this wounded land in order to hear its murmuring silences and muted cries, to remember and reconfigure the space-time mattering of all hibakusha and their material entanglements. I have always been aware of being hibakusha, but as soon as I started walking through the small passage within the fenced area led by my guide, my always present awareness of being a victim disappeared from my mind. It was as if I had become 14 years old again. I may have been walking towards an unknown ground zero as though I were someone from the time before August 9, but it was when I stood in front of the memorial that I was truly exposed to the atomic bomb. Looking back, I did not shed a tear on August 9. As I ran with a pack of people whose hands, feet, faces no longer looked human, no tears came to me. For the first time here at Trinity, however, I might be crying with human tears that I did not shed on August 9. Standing on the land that speaks no words, I shivered, feeling its pain. Until today, I have lived with the merciless pains that hurt my mind and body, but it could have been the pain of the skin that grew from August 9. Here in the desert, I had momentarily forgotten my life as hibakusha. It is here, in the midst of nothingness, the place where living and dying meet, where time being is indeterminately multiple and filled with all matter of desiring impossibilities, that the travel-hopping scribe can finally lay to rest her 52 classmates who were denied their own deaths. Long ago, she had taken on this responsibility for the 52 and carried them around with her all these years. It is in putting herself at risk and risking her sense of self, this work of embodied remembering, that she can finally release her tears and let them rain down on the ground. In returning to the nothingness, she brings one void in its particularity, Nagasaki, to another, Trinity. Not to renormalize the infinite violences, avoidances, and erasures, but to bring to bear the clouds of impossibilities that surround these entangled events. What does it mean to confront the nothingness, to touch its fullness? This is a question that cannot be answered in the abstract, not once and for all, but must be asked over and over again with one's body. This question, which must be lived, returns us to a question that has been held in suspension. For whom is the Trinity site, ground zero, empty? Clearly, this land is far from empty. On the contrary, it is teeming with all matter of impossibilities, material conditions of living and dying. Living and dying in this void are a multitude of beings excluded from the designation of human. Not only those beings living here at ground zero at the time of the Trinity test, including rattlesnakes, insects, plants, rocks, and soil, but also all of those time beings downwind from the test site, including those who don't get counted as fully human, together with the ghosts of their deceased ancestors and their future offspring. That is, what resides in the void are all of those who endure despite layer upon layer of colonial and racialized violence, all those whom the human counts as other, including those marked as subhuman, non-human, inhuman. In fact, this parcel of Turtle Island, designated as the wilderness of New Mexico, on and around Trinity site, is home to 19 American Indian pueblos, 2 Apache tribes, and some chapters of the Navajo Nation. The fact that there were 19,000 people living within a 50-mile radius of the secret test is something that was not only ignored by the US government until 2014, but unfortunately is also not mentioned by Hayashi, though they surely belong among her kin. The story was written before 2014, in all fairness. For Hayashi, it is precisely the question of remembering and just mourning that defines being human. What makes us human is not our alleged distinctiveness from the non-human, the inhuman, those denied animacy and defined by their indifference, the subhuman, humans that don't count as fully human, those who do not matter, but rather our relationship with and responsibility to the dead, to the ghosts of the past and the future. Her pilgrimage is a work of mourning, a concerted, ongoing labor, never finished nor complete. Hayashi's political, ethical commitment to the activism of remembering the hibakusha has been a life practice of tracing the entangled violences of colonialism, racism, nationalism dispersed across space-time. Crucial to this ongoing labor of mourning is the work of decomposition, composting, turning over the humus, undoing the notion of the human founded on the poisoned soil of human exceptionalism, not in order to privilege all other beings over the human in some perverse reversal, but in order to begin to come to terms with the infinite depths of our inhumanity and the infinite possibilities for living and dying otherwise. Thank you so much.
While folks are thinking about their questions, I'm going to start. One of the things that I appreciated it was your toggling back and forth between physics and... One of the things that I appreciated was your ability to toggle back and forth between physics and philosophy, between physics and literature. And as somebody who is very interested in one of the many dimensions that you talked about, temporality, I want to ask you to talk a little, to make a translation step for me, which is that something that I think we share is this interest in temporality and the relationship between the past, the present, and the future. When I'm thinking about temporality in relationship to social justice, I'm thinking about grammar. And so one of the things I was trying to translate is the ways in which you, as a physicist, or thinking through physics, are collapsing those temporalities. But one of the ways in which you do that is through reference to this amazing tense that we don't use very much anymore. And that tense is, let me get my notes. Well, you actually use something else. Okay. You use the present perfect, right? Which is having been, or this had been, right? So when you're talking about the erasure, we're talking about, it's almost as if the future becomes erased and collapsed into a present past. So I just wanted to ask you, is that the definition of the future, right? Is it about infinite possibility? Is it about present pasts? Because I use the future real conditional, right? That which will have had to be, or will have had to happen. And so I guess that in bringing this, making the larger connection that you're already making to questions of social justice, questions of humanity, and particularly in relationship to the novel, or actually it's a memoir, really, a novella. How would you make that bridge? How then, because I kept thinking, I can see the relationship between the present and the past, but is there a concept of futurity that is contained within your approach?
Okay, well, I'm out of my depths with grammar, but one of the things that I can tell you is that in doing the quantum eraser experiment, the future anterior is forced upon you in terms of interpreting the experiment. Something else, though, that's really important in terms of your question about the future and what the future might entail, comes from the fact that when I use this phrase space-time mattering, it's because neither space nor time nor matter can be presumed independently of specific interactions. So that temporality itself doesn't have a certain way of proceeding or marking what is past, present, and future in that kind of linear way that we do it, without the specificities of the interaction, okay? So the future, though, also another feature of this is that the future is not going to be something that has to happen in a certain sense, because there's this indeterminacy. You don't have determinism. So it's not like because of something that happened in the past, the future will just unfold in a particular kind of way, because there's this strange topology of the infolding of things that we call past, present, and future. And so the sense of futurity that I would have has the past enfolded inside of it, but in very particular kinds of ways that depend upon, you know, the nature of the entanglements that we're talking about. So that's why I try to show the difference in the structures of the void. The void at Trinity site is not the void in Nagasaki. So there are, you know, different histories that have been sedimented there that constitute the differences in those voids. And so, and another point that's important about futurity is that there are all these various possibilities in how they diffract through one another. And it's not a collapse to one possibility. So that, you know, and again, in the nature of these interactions, the fact that I have a specific diffraction pattern of what constitutes futurity matters. And then you'd have to think it through with specific kinds of examples, you know, specific ways in which we're talking about what the materiality of those instances that we want to think through entail.
I have a follow-up, but I'm not going to ask it. I'm going to ask for a mic over here.
I have two questions, and I'm wondering if you could speak. The first one is, I wonder if you could speak a little bit about quantum theory as it relates to ecology and climate change. And the second sort of observation, I noticed the book is translated by Aiko Atake, and I'm wondering if you look at her work and you see an embodied practice that maybe could speak to the change in perception of time in her work.
Yes, there's a little dot inside of here, the infinite part, because it's not empty. Let's see if I can actually get this. Yes, I was thinking very much about Aiko Atake's work, you know, these amazing dances on the radiated sites of Fukushima, because this dance and this choreography is a part of the very histories that I'm talking about. So, yeah, I find her work just off the charts, amazing. So. Yes. Yeah, I wrote a whole piece about that got cut out of a paper I submitted, and so I'm going to have to find some other venue for placing it, or maybe it never will be in public writing. But if you want to share something, happy to talk more about that. But yeah, I think this is part of. There are many more parts of this story. This is just one snippet of the larger work. So.
There was also the question about ecology, that was the first part of your question.
Yeah, well, I think the ecology question goes to this, right? There's this way in which, of course, one can ask, why does Japan have so many nuclear reactors and depend so much on nuclear energy? And that goes to the Atoms for Peace program, the U.S. Basically enforced as part of, that the U.S. enforced as part of what happened in the aftermath of the war, showing the positive aspects of the bomb. So yeah, all of these various things are imploded into this this moment, and this is surely one very important aspect of that. So that's why I started out with the question also of climate change and the way in which radioactivity and the bomb tests have been pointed out as being, one of the markers for the golden spike. And of course, the reason why we have this uniformity of radioactive material all across the globe is because in the narrative that we usually tell ourselves, we say that there were 2 atomic bombs dropped. Not only is there a third here that was very crucial that Hayashi go and explore, but over 2,000 bombs have been dropped, mostly on indigenous peoples. Bikini Atoll, one glaring example, completely uninhabitable. But the largest number of bombs that have actually been dropped have been on the native peoples of the Southwest United States.
Hi, I'm a student in the Philosophical Foundations of Physics program, so this is totally down my alley, and I hope you'll indulge 2 questions of mine as well. The first one has to do with our experience of a direction of time in the context of these indeterminacies, and if you accept the conclusion that exceedingly special initial conditions, give rise to something as metaphysical as a direction of time. And my second question is, what is your take on the measurement problem, especially given quantum erasure and how the concepts of traces and measurement and observation are intimately related?
Yeah.
Thank you.
That's great. I didn't know there was such a program here, so love to talk with you more. So let me just, in terms of the direction of time, I'm actually going to cite a paper of a student of mine named Astrid Schrader. And Astrid did this amazing piece of work on the second law of thermodynamics, which is really what you're pointing to when you point to a directionality of time. And then in terms of the measurement problem, I do actually tackle the measurement problem and some other ways in which I feel that I need to justify my relational ontology interpretation of quantum physics, which is in chapter 7 of my book. It's the chapter many, many people jump over. I know. And it is, in some ways, because I know that people were jumping over that chapter, that I started talking about the quantum eraser in other kinds of ways, first in a paper in Derrida today, and now in this work again, in order to bring forward, there's so much that's politically important about what's going on in chapter 7. It just, if I can work my way towards reading post-structuralist theory and deconstruction, I figure, The only equations that are in the book are multiply two numbers and add. So no, in all seriousness, really try to work through these things in Chapter 7 with a great deal of care, including the measurement problem. So I'm just going to refer you to that.
Which book is this?
Meeting the Universe Halfway, Quantum Physics and the Entanglement of Matter and Meaning.
Great. And I'm so sorry. One last question
Yes.
that came to mind. So I remember an article of Helen Longino where she says that, you know, epistemic values in physics like ontological simplicity, reductionism, breadth of scope, they actually have, you know, socio-political underpinnings. And because she's a feminist philosopher, often at the expense of, or often in favor of patriarchal values. So I was wondering, do you think that there can be a distinction between epistemic and non-epistemic values? It seems like, based on your presentation, that there can't be even in abstract or theoretical pure science.
Yeah, yeah. You know, I think Helen's contribution to science as social knowledge is a really important one at a particular moment of time in the development of feminist science studies. It was this really, and also I think in the philosophy of science overall, the fact that it was published with Princeton University Press, I think is significant, and it was trying to address some things that were left unaddressed after Thomas Kuhn. And the notion that background assumptions are absolutely necessary in both identifying evidence and making any kind of reasoning about evidence is absolutely crucial. And I feel like what Niels Bohr does actually takes it another step, because what Bohr gives us is not that he's getting rid of empiricism. He's saying, what is the objective referent for any kind of empirical values or data? And that is the phenomenon rather than the object itself. And now we're in a whole other ballgame. Once it's the phenomenon, the material-discursive phenomenon, which is inseparable from the apparatuses that help produce it, we're always already in the realm of, before even the split between nature and culture, or science and society, and so on and so forth. So, thanks for the questions.
Oh, a wonderful, wonderful paper, and so much there. And I'm prefacing this because I want to say something a little more focused. So there are many ways to respond to this. One of the things I began to feel was that we are both wave and particle. We're at an interface in our existence so that a mind can contemplate what you were saying in terms of the complexity, but each of us as a consequence is at a particular point of view, a selective perception. So we have simultaneity, I think, is one of the points, you know, in all of this existing simultaneously in time, forward and backward, et cetera, all that. And yet we're at a place of selective perception, which suggests to me, in terms of Derrida, we can't get there from here, which I think was always one of his major points. Presence is beyond our capacity to reach in an empirical or in an embodied manner. So that's just one aspect of how I experienced your lecture. I don't know how you respond to that, but we're in a tough position here.
Well, thank you for that. I wouldn't say that we're simultaneously both wave and particle, but we might have different experiences that are of being wave and of being particle. And I think one of the interesting things, going back to the question of grammar, about the question of simultaneity, because we're used to talking about something like, even if it seems far-fetched, being here and there simultaneously. The troubling of time here is such that I barely know how to say this, to speak it, because it's not that different times are happening simultaneously. in a sense. It's as if in the here-ness of here, there's yesterday, today, and tomorrow. So it's a coexistence that I don't even think we have a kind of term for, because it's so strange to us to think of moments that are bleeding through one another, but not in terms of our own lives, in terms of our own phenomenological experience. Like I was saying in the beginning of my lecture, I'm here now in, standing and even sitting before you as the kid that I was in 1984 when I took a job at Barnard, as well as being, this older person with totally gray hair sitting before you, and many other things. These moments bleed through one another in ways that I think that we're much more used to. But what I'm saying is that those features of time are not merely subjective experiences. That's the way the world's experiencing itself too.
Thank you so much for that lecture. I guess just to try to get at the political valences that you were asking us to consider, given the material that you presented in terms of this theory of time. I mean, is it fair to say that you're trying to interrupt these mainstream theories of the Anthropocene that give us the doomsday clock and tell us that, we have 2 minutes to go, by showing us that doomsday has already arrived for certain populations, right?
Yes.
So this privilege of counting down to something as if like we're sitting here, what can we do to prevent something, when in fact all of this material from Trinity to Trinity, from the bomb sites that are, is in the midst of these Native American pueblos that were already at the end of an earlier erasure and elimination. The politics of this seem like something that we would want to underscore. It's not just about simultaneous time frames and trying to figure out how to situate ourselves in relationship to them, but recognizing that power works by offering one temporal sequence as the temporal sequence, when in fact there are multiple temporal sequences for different people who are differentially located, whether as particles or waves.
Yes. It's after the end of the world, don't you know that yet, as Sun Ra says. And I think that that's an absolutely crucial point of how these discourses take place in a certain way that really doesn't take account. I mean, a lot of people say there isn't a sense of the unevenness around the globe, but there isn't a sense of the unevenness around the clock either. I think it's really important that, that what violence also produces is you don't know what time it is. What time is it now? I think you put it beautifully, Jack, and I would just add to what you said, but thank you.
I was just gonna ask how you would kind of reconcile the notion of classical physics with the quantum field theory, where you kind of make a point that they're both entangled with the political scenes at which they're coming to the fore, in the sense that quantum field theory research is deeply entangled with the United States military apparatus and research, and that also that this classical physical theory of the void is the foundation for 17th and 18th century European colonialism, but that at the same time you kind of gesture that not that quantum field theory is an update on classical physics, but that it is in a sense a way to undo or work against the logic of land occupation and colonialism that's built on classical physics. So I don't know, I'm just wondering how if you see the two as what possibilities you see for one to kind of fix the other, or one to work against the other's political failures. I don't know if that makes sense.
Yeah, thank you for that question. I'm not so sure that one will fix the other, but there's a different kind of way in which they function. And one of the things that I think is really important, both politically in terms and also in terms of the physics, in answering your question, is classical physics is also here now in a certain kind of important way. One of the constant questions I get is about, well, quantum physics is just about the really, really small, and we live in a classical Newtonian world. And I'm constantly trying to explain that that's not the way that we understand it to be. Actually, that there's a change of ontology here, how we understand the very way that the world is, and it doesn't stop at a certain kind of scale. But there still are these, it still hangs on, not only in terms of these ways that tries to banish a certain kind of queerness of the quantum and quarantine it to the very, very small, but also a way in which, the effects of Newtonianism still are with us in terms of those, old voyages of discovery. Are still the new frontiers of the space race, which are entangled with the making of bombs and so on and so forth. So it's once again this way in which inside of this moment are all of these other moments, and now I have to understand them in their specificity and not just to wave it off by saying that. And so the question that you ask, I think, is really important question about how this functions. And I think also, interestingly enough, is that when people make a gesture towards Newtonian physics, they forget about its queerness and Newton's queerness. Newton used to accuse Robert Hooke, of his competitor, of saying he was constantly trying to embroil him with women. And he allegedly died a virgin, not having ever been with a woman, and I don't think those two things are the same thing. At any rate, but Newton was a really interesting character in all of this as well, because he practiced biblical prophecy as much as his projections for the future using Newtonian mechanics. But in his biblical prophecy, there were not ethereal spirits, but in his physics, there were. In his physics, there were these spirits of the ether, and that gave an explanation, for example, for how the Earth knows about the sun. It knows about the sun because the ethereal spirits carry that signal back and forth to each other. And then at one point, Newton has a funny relationship with these spirits, and he banishes the spirits. And the minute he banishes the spirits, they say, well, then how can you explain gravity? And he says, well, I feign no hypothesis. That's when they accuse him of mysticism. So I think that that's an interesting story that's part of another book that I'm working on that comes out of that's actually, the paper in Derrida today is a really small slice of a bigger text that could be called Spectres of Newton, just like Spectres of Marx. And so the possibilities for going back to Newton and seeing what's there rather than Newton purely as the foil against which, quantum mechanics can serve as the correction, I think a different story needs to be told about that, and I think your question was alluding to it, so thank you.
Thank you all for your questions, and thank you, Karen, for your presentation.